Welcome, and it's a great privilege to be here speaking and also for a recording for the Poniente de Granada about the particular health opportunities for extra virgin olive oil from this part of Spain. Just to introduce myself, my name is Dr. Simon Poole. I'm a medical doctor from Cambridge in the UK. I have become increasingly interested in the Mediterranean diet and in particular the health qualities of extra virgin olive oil. I started talking to my patients perhaps about 15 or 20 years ago about the Mediterranean diet, and with increasing research about the benefits of extra virgin olive oil in particular, I spend increasing amounts of time talking to the public, and I'm very privileged to be invited to various parts of the world to talk about how we can communicate about the benefits of extra virgin olive oil as part of the Mediterranean diet. So I wanted to start just by saying that I think every part of the Mediterranean diet, every producing area for extra virgin olive oil has a beautiful story to tell. And there's a beautiful story to tell in this part of the world about the production of extra virgin olive oil. And I think the level of awareness about the benefits of extra virgin olive oil is very low. We see that the majority of extra virgin olive oil that is being bought in Europe and in the USA is probably pretty poor quality oil. And so it's about really trying to help people to understand about the benefits of extra virgin olive oil and to tell them the story about the places from which the oil comes. And I've been working with Antonio for some time about how we tell this story, and this is a shot of a workshop that we did at Oriel, one of the members of the cooperative. I think it was about 3 years ago, Antonio, where we were helping to educate importers of oil from Europe to understand about the benefits of extra virgin olive oil, and particular from the oils from this part of Spain and this part of the world. So it's important to look at extra virgin olive oil in its historical context. It is a produce that's been around for thousands of years. Probably the earliest olive oil production was about 6,000 years ago, and there's some evidence that it was produced in the Levant area, in the Fertile Crescent, first of all, in what is modern-day Jordan and Palestine, Syria. Really, at the beginning of farming, olive oil was a fundamental part of nutrition for those peoples in ancient times. And so it really is the basis of the oldest diet in the world. The Mediterranean diet is the oldest diet in the world. It's the most healthy diet, and it's not just a fashion that's coming here for a few years. It is the oldest and healthiest diet and has been over many millennia. And of course the story of the Mediterranean diet is that the olive tree was brought from the Levant by the Phoenicians, probably about 1000, 2000 BC, across the Mediterranean to Italy, to northern Africa, to Spain, and we know that Malaga, for example, was an early port where the Phoenicians settled and introduced the olive tree to Spain. And now we have a modern understanding of the health benefits of extra virgin olive oil as part of the Mediterranean diet, but we often think about the Mediterranean diet as being first described in the 1960s, 1950s and 60s by Professor Ansel Keys, but of course we know that the Mediterranean diet has been rooted in this part of the world for many thousands of years. And here are some slides just demonstrating that Fertile Crescent, that area where the olive tree was first cultivated all those many millennia ago, and a mosaic of Phoenicians first pressing oil all those thousands of years ago. You know, it's an extraordinary to think about the ancient times, the Romans milling oil. This is from a slide. The first slide is of a mill from Jordan, and the symbolism of the tree, again a slide from Jordan where we show that a tree that was planted by I think it was the last Pope, or it might have been Pope John Paul actually, to symbolize peace, that the olive tree represented to the peoples of the Middle East. And so we're at an exciting new chapter of the story of the Mediterranean diet and of the story of extra virgin olive oil, because the Mediterranean diet has been ranked the most healthy diet in the world for 4 successive years now by the US News Committee, which look at diets each year to try to establish the healthiest. And really it is the healthy dietary pattern that is here to stay. And we can see how olive oil is part of that diet. You won't be able to see the details of this slide. I will bring this slide back later on in the talk. But this shows olive oil and the scientific evidence that is now being accrued about its anti-inflammatory properties, its antioxidant properties, its effectiveness at protecting us from so many chronic diseases as part of the Mediterranean diet. And of course, Spain is one of the areas where the Mediterranean diet is enjoyed, and actually Spain has got this secret of longevity, which possibly relates to some of the cultural aspects about the lifestyle here, but also fundamentally to the Mediterranean diet and where extra virgin olive oil sits in that diet. And I think Spain is destined, I think in the next 10 to 20 years, to be well established as being the place of longest life in the world. And so Spain can be very proud of that accolade, and probably much of it comes down to the diet. So the Mediterranean diet in itself is just a recipe for wellness. It's not a diet that will simply make you lose weight or might protect you from one particular illness. We can see that it reduces the risks of heart disease or stroke, of obesity, diabetes, of cancers, of Alzheimer's disease even, Parkinson's disease, and all sorts of inflammatory conditions. And because we know now that most chronic conditions are caused by chronic inflammation, we are seeing that it is the anti-inflammatory effects of extra virgin olive oil which are probably driving much of the benefits of the Mediterranean diet. So it's a reduced risk of early death and also depression. And you can even see markers of aging reduced with people on the Mediterranean diet. We have little protein caps on the end of our DNA called telomeres in our cells. And as the cells divide and as we age, those protein caps shorten. And people who adhere to the Mediterranean diet rich in extra virgin olive oil have been shown to have longer telomere caps on their DNA, showing that actually their aging processes are slowed by the Mediterranean diet. So what is the Mediterranean diet? Well, this talk is more about extra virgin olive oil, so I won't spend too much time on the diet as a whole, but we can see how it's described in illustrations such as this from our friends in Old Ways in Boston, where it's predominantly vegetables, whole grains, fruits, lots of colors in the diet, herbs and spices, regular consumption of nuts, some oily fish, a moderate amount of dairy in the form often of raw, unpasteurized cheese, for example, some wine if that sits with religious observance, and processed foods really very uncommonly, and some red meat, but less commonly consumed. And we understand now why the Mediterranean diet works. We can describe why it works, because the quality of the carbohydrates is high, they are low glycemic index carbohydrates, it's rich in fiber, it's got unrefined sugars, so those sugars are held into the whole grains, it's got relatively low saturated fat, and the quality of the saturated fats, which are predominantly saturated fats from the milk and cheese of goats and sheep, are probably better saturated fats than the saturated fats we see in other parts of our diet. High in monounsaturated fats, of course, in olive oil, high in omega-3 fats, which we commonly get from oily fish. And it's got high quality proteins as well, so less protein from red meat, more protein from beans, legumes, which also pack a punch with plenty of fiber and other vitamins and minerals and nutrients. So it's a really, really healthy dietary pattern. We know that food is more than just the carbohydrates and the proteins and the fats anyway. We know that food is much more subtle than that, and it's a diet which is a food, not described just as carbs or proteins. It's the quality of the food, it helps maintain a healthy weight, positive lifestyle along with it. And we're even beginning to understand some of the subtleties of the diet, that it has an effect on our gut microbes, a positive effect, and even affects the way in which our genes are expressed. So it can even affect turn on, turn off genes which are associated with cancers, for example. The Mediterranean diet can even have that kind of influence. It's a plant-based diet, and the great thing about the Mediterranean diet is it's about positive nutrition. So instead of saying we mustn't eat this or we mustn't eat that because it's bad for us, we're talking about foods we really can eat and we really can enjoy. And of course, at the center of the Mediterranean diet is extra virgin olive oil. So I haven't talked too much about the Mediterranean diet as a whole. We could talk about it as a separate lecture for an hour, but we're going to focus on extra virgin olive oil. And we could spend an hour or more talking about the Mediterranean diet, but you can read about it in my latest book, The Real Mediterranean Diet, if you wish to. So the Mediterranean diet is also a diet which is a diet about sustainability. We have to talk about the Mediterranean diet, any food we consume, we have to talk about it in the context of the planet. And there's very, very good evidence now to show that the Mediterranean diet pyramid is a pyramid which is healthy and sustainable for the planet. It's an environmentally friendly diet. It's plant-based. It relies much less on red meat, which we know is a contributing factor to climate change. And so you can see pyramids like this, and the pyramid that is most associated with sustainability is a pyramid which is very similar in appearance to the Mediterranean diet pyramid. And again, we know that extra virgin olive oil, as part of that sustainable story, is very good for the planet. So for every litre of extra virgin olive oil produced on a well-managed grove, it sinks 10 kilograms of carbon back into the planet, back into the system. So it's an incredibly sustainable dietary pattern moving forwards over the next 20 to 30 years. So just to look at extra virgin olive oil, we can talk about the Mediterranean diet, and we can talk about regional Mediterranean diets. So we can talk about the Mediterranean diet that is enjoyed in Palestine, in Lebanon, in the near Middle East. We can talk about the Mediterranean diet that is consumed in North Africa, Tunisia, Italy, Spain. They're all unique. They're all different in terms of the pattern of food. They have different spices, different reliances on other elements to the diet, different consumptions of alcohol. For example, in North Africa, often due to religious reasons, no alcohol is consumed. So what is the common theme of the Mediterranean diet? And I think ultimately it's extra virgin olive oil and vegetables. And so my dietary pyramid would look more like this than the previous Mediterranean diet, because I think this puts extra virgin olive oil absolutely at the center of the Mediterranean diet. I like this pyramid because it places it there with such great importance. And indeed, I've written my first book was called The Olive Oil Diet, which was really expressing how olive oil is fundamentally part of that diet. And that's now very fortunately been translated into Turkish and also into Spanish and also into Bulgarian. So how do we measure the effects of extra virgin olive oil as part of the Mediterranean diet? Well, when scientists study the Mediterranean diet, they ask people to fill food questionnaires, and they study what people are consuming. And these are the points that are put on each element of the Mediterranean diet. And what is really interesting is this is an example of the kind of scoring system that scientists would use. And what's really interesting is how much strength is given in terms of that point system to the consumption of extra virgin olive oil with every meal, and it actually represents almost as much in that scoring as the consumption of vegetables. And then we can look at extra virgin olive oil and we can take this single ingredient and we can actually demonstrate just this ingredient seems to have its own very measurable health benefits. So for example, in 2011, a study in Bordeaux showed that there was a 70% difference in risk of stroke between people who are consuming high quantities of extra virgin olive oil and people who are consuming very low. In 2012, as part of a big study called the EPIC study, it was showed that the regular 20 ml consumption of extra virgin olive oil reduced the risk of heart disease. It was associated, at least, with a reduction in the risk of heart disease by as much as half, and the reduction of all-cause mortality by 26%. So that's just through the consumption regularly of a tablespoon, 2 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil each day. And we could go on looking at the studies which show that extra virgin olive oil has a beneficial effect on blood pressure. There's associations of reduced risk of cancers, reduced risk of blood clotting, reduced risk of markers of inflammation, and even reduced risks of dementia. And there was a really interesting study about dementia which came out of the University of Thessalonica only last year, which showed that if you took a group of people who were in the early stages of Alzheimer's and you gave them a low polyphenol extra virgin olive oil, and you gave another group exactly the same type of people with early dementia, very high polyphenol extra virgin olive oil, that's high in anti-inflammatory antioxidants, the progression towards end-stage dementia was much slowed in the group who are consuming high polyphenol extra virgin olive oil. And we will come back to the importance of polyphenols, these anti-inflammatory compounds in extra virgin olive oil, in a few moments. So we can tell some stories about extra virgin olive oil in its own right, as to try to encourage people to understand the benefits that it can give people. So it's an antioxidant. It contains antioxidant and anti-inflammatory elements in the extra virgin olive oil. It increases the sensitivity to insulin. So insulin is the hormone that makes sure that the glucose, the sugars that we absorb from our carbohydrates, gets dispatched and gets processed by our bodies in a healthy way. And olive oil, extra virgin olive oil, increases our sensitivity to our insulin, which reduces the risk of getting diabetes and of putting on weight. It also decreases the glycemic load of meals. So if you have a carbohydrate-based meal, so if you have some bread or if you have some pasta, and it causes a sugar rise, which we know repeatedly, lots of sharp spikes in the sugar can eventually lead to diabetes and obesity. We know that if you smother it in extra virgin olive oil, that will decrease the amount the sugar rises after a meal, reducing the risk of potentially developing diabetes or putting on weight, with the benefit of the extra virgin olive oil as part of that meal. And there are more stories. The nitrates in plants and extra virgin olive oil fats combine to lower blood pressure. The antioxidants in extra virgin olive oil protect it from the effects of heat, so it is absolutely safe to cook with extra virgin olive oil, and not only is it safe, but it's actually desirable, and we'll talk about that a little bit more a little bit later. Another bit of alchemy which happens with extra virgin olive oil is when you cook meat, when you cook in particular red meat, and in particular when you barbecue it and it changes color, what's happening is it's forming some potentially harmful chemicals, what we call heterocyclic amines, which have been implicated in cancer. Now, if you marinate in extra virgin olive oil, as is often the tradition in Mediterranean diets, then you reduce the formation of those potentially harmful chemicals when you cook meat by perhaps as much as 80% in some studies. So it's not surprising perhaps that the risk of bowel cancer, for example, is much less in the Mediterranean than it is because of that culture of using extra virgin olive oil whilst cooking and meat and marinating as a preparation. We also know that when we cook with food, a lot of interactions go on, and people say, well, is it safe to cook in extra virgin olive oil? Another story about why it's not only safe but it's desirable is the story about frying fish. So we have fish which are rich in omega-3 polyunsaturated fats. These omega-3 polyunsaturated fats are very sensitive to the heat. If we cook it in extra virgin olive oil, the extra virgin olive oil wraps itself around these fish as we cook, and it protects the omega-3s, those precious oils from the fish, those precious fats from the fish. It protects them from breaking down under the heat as you're cooking. So you get an increased availability as well of all the antioxidants, all the components in vegetables when you cook with extra virgin olive oil. So we're beginning to understand a little bit more, and I'm going from here to a conference in Jaén, and that is part of my journey through Montefrio today, and we'll discuss in Jaén over a few days the latest evidence about extra virgin olive oil. And of course, it's not just a fat, it's not just a healthy fat, but it contains other elements, for example, vitamin E, but most importantly, perhaps, it contains elements we call polyphenols, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And so this actually is a slide that was produced by Jaén University showing the various benefits that extra virgin olive oil has been shown to confer, reducing the risk of heart disease, reducing the risk of clotting, reducing the risk of inflammatory illnesses and so on, often driven by these particular compounds you can see the structure of here, things like hydroxytyrosol, things like oleopurin, oleocanthal, and so on, these polyphenols which are naturally occurring in extra virgin olive oil. So it's a healthy fat which helps you to feel full, it's stable to heat, it improves cholesterol profile, and it actually helps you absorb your fat-soluble vitamins as well. But really, it's the unique antioxidant, anti-inflammatory compounds which are really important in driving down the risk of chronic diseases. And these polyphenols reduce the risk of heart disease and cancer and reduce harmful oxidation and inflammation. So what are polyphenols? I often say to people, what is a polyphenol and why are they so important in extra virgin olive oil? Polyphenols are not just present in extra virgin olive oil. They are present in many plants, in many fruits, in many vegetables, and they often give the color to those fruits and vegetables. But there are some very specific, very unique, and very powerful polyphenols in extra virgin olive oil. So I want to talk about how polyphenols work in nature, and how polyphenols work for us in humans. This is a slide of an apple showing an apple which has been exposed to oxygen. And what you can see immediately is a change in the color, and that's oxidation which occurs. And that's what the apple wishes to protect itself from, because clearly when an apple goes brown, it's starting to go bad. So let's talk about polyphenols in plants first of all. Plants are really smart. I think we undervalue plants. They are really phenomenally clever. We cut them down, we burn them, we tread on them, and we often don't give them much credit, but they are phenomenally clever. Evolution has given them the power to control their environment. So a plant growing, particularly in this part of the world where it's hot, where it's arid, where there are lots of challenges in the environment, oxygen is a highly reactive atom, and particularly in its most reactive form in free radicals. And that will cause damage and breakdown and reactions. So the plant protects itself from all those chemical reactions of oxygen by producing polyphenols, which are antioxidants. They combat, they put out the fires that oxygen creates. These are compounds which protect the plant from chemistry, from the oxygen and from the stress, which is increased in UV light, increased in heat, and increased in environmental stress. So the plants produce these polyphenols, and not only are they smart because they produce them to protect their fruits, they also sometimes produce them to help them protect the inner part of plants. So it's often in bark, for example. Cinnamon is very rich in polyphenols. But they protect the plant from oxygen, but they're very smart because they also protect them often from microbial attack. They often give them colors to signal to creatures that are going to perhaps come and consume the fruit and distribute the seed elsewhere. They're often used as signalers, and they're often used when the plant is not ready for the animal to come and eat it. They are often given a bitter or a peppery taste to actually put off the passing cow from consuming that fruit or that vegetable. So polyphenols are really important. They are the immune system. They are the protection for plants. And of course, we also live in a highly challenging environment. We live in an environment with lots of toxins, lots of environmental challenges, and our own metabolism produces free radicals as well, produces oxygen atoms which are highly reactive and which can destroy our own tissue. So when we consume polyphenols from plants, we're consuming protective compounds, protective chemicals that can protect our bodies from oxidative stress. And there are some very specific and very unique antioxidant and anti-inflammatory compounds in olive oil, as we will go on and see. The other smart thing about plants is that when their environment is even more challenged, they can respond by increasing the polyphenols that are in their fruit or in their vegetables to protect them even further from that challenging environment. And we will see this in extra virgin olive oil. You also see it in grapes and in wines and so on, where you have a higher antioxidant polyphenol level when you have a stressed vine. So polyphenols in action is fascinating to see as well. So if you have, this was an experiment which I think is absolutely fascinating. If you have a group of individuals, and this was a small study but it's been replicated with more people, if you have a group of people and you feed them essentially a low polyphenol diet, a low anti-inflammatory diet, a low vegetable diet, a low olive oil diet, let's say, a diet which is full of junk food, which is very poor quality. You feed them that for 48 hours, and you measure in their bodies the amount of inflammation the low-grade inflammation they've got. You can see that measurement, and we measure it with compounds. We do this in medicine. We measure it with interleukin. We measure it with TNF. We measure it with CRP. There are names where we can measure inflammation in the blood. And then you feed this group of individuals a single meal of sofrito, which is onions and garlic and tomatoes and extra virgin olive oil, full of polyphenols. You will see their inflammatory markers in their blood measured 2 hours afterwards fall, which is quite extraordinary, because it means that what I ate for breakfast can potentially decide what level of low-lying inflammation I have. And remember, inflammation is fundamentally the cause of most chronic diseases. What I eat this morning makes a difference to how many inflammatory, what inflammation is going on in my body this afternoon, which is quite extraordinary. And we can see this again just with extra virgin olive oil. And here is a slide showing that giving a dose of extra virgin olive oil can reduce some of these inflammatory markers that we talk about, the CRP, interleukins, TNF, we can all measure, showing that it then decreases these markers and protects us from a risk of heart disease, stroke, that's peripheral artery disease. So all of those conditions we can see reduced with the reduction in that inflammation. And polyphenols, as I mentioned, are produced by plants, and they are often produced as a combination of reasons: to protect the plants from oxidative stress, from these oxygen-free radical reactions, to protect the plant from UV light, protect the plant from potentially from microbes. So a lot of polyphenols actually have antimicrobial, antibacterial, and even antiviral properties. But also they often make them bitter. And the olive tree in particular will make its olive bitter, because actually it doesn't really want humans to eat its olives. And probably, and this is purely hypothesis, but probably because if you are an olive tree and you grow in quite arid, challenging, difficult conditions, your best bet is to get a bird to eat your olive, because then it can fly and it can take your offspring, your seed, to a completely different area where it will not compete with the parent plant. It's a bit like us wanting to let our teenage kids go after a certain time because we actually need the room for ourselves. And so the olive tree has made this bitter. And you see this with chilies as well. Birds are not affected by the heat of chili peppers. And again, chili plants often, it seems, are distributed by birds taking their seed away. But of course, humans are quite smart as well. And so what we've discovered is that if you press the fruit of the olive tree actually you can produce oil which is less bitter. And this morning I always, almost out of a ceremony, whenever I see a tree with an olive oil, with an olive on it, I will always take a little bite, just to get that sense of acute bitterness. But then if you have the oil, it's softer, it's sweeter. Some of that bitterness is taken away. But not all of the bitterness, and not all of the pungency, not all of those tastes which we can actually learn to value and really enjoy. And what's interesting about this slide is that it shows many of those polyphenols giving bitterness, giving pungency, giving a slight burning sensation. And it's these polyphenols which are having the antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects in our bodies, which we can taste in a good extra virgin olive oil, which will give us some bitterness and some pepperiness, which we need to learn to value. I think we can absolutely enjoy not only the fruitiness of a good extra virgin olive oil, but that pepper and that bitterness are positive attributes to the taste, and they're also denoting and giving us health. So I want to talk a little bit about one of the big myths about extra virgin olive oil, and this is kind of presentation I give to people to tell the story about extra virgin olive oil. And a question I often get asked is, well, what about the smoke point? So the smoke point of an oil, when you cook it, is the temperature at which it starts to break down. And usually when it breaks down, it produces trans fats. And trans fats are potentially harmful, potentially cancer-causing fats. And more so actually causing heart disease. And this was a study which showed they took extra virgin olive oil on the far left, virgin olive oil and refined olive oil, and they compared it with other oils. Interestingly, with canola oil, we know that in the UK as rapeseed oil, and this was, I think, after 40 minutes, they heated the oil up to 210, 220 degrees centigrade, and then cooled it down to normal cooking temperatures. And after 40 minutes, these were the trans fats that were released. And you can see extra virgin olive oil performed the best in comparison with all these other fats. So people say to me, well, I don't understand, because I thought that extra virgin olive oil has a low smoke point. And so I then say, well, okay, let's talk about the smoke point. A good extra virgin olive oil will have a smoke point of about 200 and 210 degrees. What temperature do you cook at? And people usually don't know that as it happens. Anyway, I explain that usually people saute at 160 degrees, they roast 170 degrees, they deep fat fry at 190 degrees, below the smoke point of a good extra virgin olive oil. And of course, actually, if it was unhealthy to cook in extra virgin olive oil, the Mediterranean diet simply would not work as a healthy diet. Because if I was to get off my cruise ship on the island of Icaria in Greece, or let's say here in Malaga, I get off my cruise ship and I go up to the mountains, maybe to a little village that's very close to my heart, little village of Casares, and I climb up to the top of the mountain and I sit next to a gentleman, a Spanish gentleman, and I say, from my cruise ship, I say, oh, well, of course, I don't cook in extra virgin olive oil, I cook in coconut oil because of the smoke point. What do you think? Well, of course, this 100-year-old shepherd would laugh at me, wouldn't he? Because he's been using extra virgin olive oil to cook his entire life and benefiting from its health. So the Mediterranean diet simply couldn't work if extra virgin olive oil wasn't safe. And indeed, if you look at the antioxidants that are left after this cooking period, this was the same study, but then it looked at the number of antioxidants in oils after you'd been cooking with it. And the cooking does consume some of the antioxidants, because cooking is an oxidation process. But still at the end, extra virgin olive oil performs so much better in terms of those antioxidants left. And incidentally, olive oil, which is a refined product, has been stripped of most of its polyphenol antioxidants. That antioxidant capacity is mainly conferred by vitamin E, which is left. But the extra virgin olive oil has the vitamin E, but it also has these other powerful polyphenols. And so how do we know whether an oil is high in polyphenols? Well, we can taste it, can't we? We can taste it. It will give us a little bitterness, a little pepperiness, perhaps a little cough. maybe one cough, maybe two coughs, maybe even three coughs for a very pungent oil. And so the question is, for producers in particular, and they know this, what produces a high polyphenol, high anti-inflammatory, high antioxidant, really healthy extra virgin olive oil? Well, it's about extra virginity and low acidity. That we can make sure that we have these important polyphenols. Variety, to some extent, supports it. So in this part of the world, hojiblanca, picual, they are naturally high in polyphenol antioxidants. Processing has to be done so carefully, and avoiding oxygen and UV light and heat, because that will destroy those precious polyphenols. Time of harvest: the earlier we harvest, the richer the polyphenols. They tend to drop off as the olive matures. They tend to change slightly as well. There's a change in color, which is a change in the polyphenols to more anthocyanidin polyphenols as it changes to that darker color. But early harvesting is important to maximize the polyphenols. We've talked about agricultural factors a little bit, because the more you stress a tree, the more it responds to protect itself by producing more polyphenols. So a little bit of stress with lower irrigation helps. Altitude, and here we are in Montefrio, cold mountain. Altitude supports high polyphenols as well. That's a story that we sometimes don't hear. Plenty of evidence. Studies have shown that you can increase polyphenols by higher growth of of the tree. Organic cultivation probably increases the polyphenols as well, and of course storage is really important to protect those polyphenols from oxygen, UV light, and heat. And so I just want to run, finally, in the last few slides, just want to show you some real world applications of the importance of polyphenols. We know they're antioxidants, we know they reduce inflammation, we know there's vitamin E and squalene and also compounds called lignans which have this effect. But we have these important polyphenols. And there are more than 36 identified so far, including oleupurin, oleocanthal, and hydroxytyrosol. And I want to just talk about these three, because these three are quite fascinating polyphenols. Those are the chemical compounds for those people most interested. Oleocanthal is a really exciting polyphenol that's relatively recently been discovered. Oleocanthal has powerful anti-inflammatory effects. It has effects like ibuprofen. It's extraordinarily strong. A couple of studies showing, this is a test tube study, so it's not in humans, but it's fascinating, where you have a tumor growing essentially in a lab, and you inject it with oleocanthal, and the dividing time of those tumor cells is much reduced in the oleocanthal-rich environment. And so again, another study which shows how oleocanthal can actually kill cancer cells. We have to be careful about saying that we can apply this to humans, but this is just interesting early research about the possible potential power of oleocanthal. And here I always just take a little detour, if I may. Have I got time to take a little detour? Yeah. Right, I'll tell you the story about oleocanthal. So oleocanthal is the compound actually that gives you a particular sensation. So this was discovered a few years ago by a gentleman I've had the great privilege to meet, Professor Gary Beecham from Monell Institute in Philadelphia. And he was asked by a pharmaceutical company to explain why their cough medicine was making people cough, which is a bit strange and not very desirable. So he looked at all the compounds and he discovered that it was the liquid ibuprofen that actually was making people cough. And if you take a tablet of ibuprofen, you just swallow it. But if you have liquid ibuprofen, it can make you cough. So he told the pharmaceutical company that, and they took the ibuprofen, the liquid ibuprofen, out of the cough remedy. He then went to Sicily on a different conference, and being a sensory scientist, the Italians, first thing they said was, well, let's go out for lunch, of course. And they went out for lunch and they said, please taste our beautiful Sicilian extra virgin olive oil. And he was about to dip some bread in it, but they said, no, just taste the oil. And he tasted the oil, and it was fruity, a little bit of sense of tomato, it was quite bitter. And then he started to cough. And he thought, there's something in here which is giving me the cough, which is the same as the cough I got with the ibuprofen. So he went back to his lab in the States and he looked at the compound and identified oleocanthal as a particular compound in extra virgin olive oil which causes this cough sensation. And the remarkable thing is, remember the ibuprofen? It has a very similar anti-inflammatory effect as ibuprofen. And I'm a physician, I'm a doctor. When I see somebody who's had a heart attack, what do? I give them a small dose of aspirin as an anti-inflammatory, because we know heart disease is an inflammatory condition. So maybe this daily dose of a little bit of oleocanthal that people are getting as part of their Mediterranean diet is contributing to a reduced risk of stroke and heart disease through that anti-inflammatory mechanism. So tyrosols are another polyphenol, and the interesting thing about tyrosols is that there's some evidence which shows that if you have a buildup of cholesterol, it's not so much the blocking of arteries that's important, it's actually the inflammation of the cholesterol. It's the oxidation of the cholesterol that's most important in terms of whether or not you have another heart attack. And there is sufficiently robust scientific evidence now to show that if you have a regular consumption of extra virgin olive oil and you have hydroxytyrosol, that reduces the inflammation, the oxidative stress on your cholesterol and stabilizes potentially your heart. So in the European Union, you are allowed to make a claim on an extra virgin olive oil to being particularly healthy if it has a particular level of hydroxytyrosol. And finally, this is just a nice colorful slide, but what it demonstrates is another polyphenol at work. And this is basically where you take some researchers in Italy took some mice which are genetically susceptible to the mouse equivalent of Alzheimer's disease. And they did some what's called PET scans of their brains after 3 months and after 6 months. Some who had been fed with a diet which had been supplemented with a polyphenol called oleopurin from extra virgin olive oil. And as you can see, the density of the tangled fibers in the mice brains, in those untreated, in comparison with those treated with the oleopurin, it's OLE, the density of the tangles, which is what they're picking up, those defects in the brain, is much reduced. So although we've got to be cautious about translating animal studies into human beings, we do know that, though, as I mentioned earlier, that there's some research in Greece which showed that if you feed people with early onset Alzheimer's disease high polyphenol extra virgin olive oil, you will slow the rate of decline of their brain function. A Mediterranean diet rich in extra virgin olive oil can prevent diabetes, can support us with normal weight, can reduce our blood pressure, can reduce our risk of heart disease, all of those things which are associated with the worst cases of the worst case scenarios with COVID. So it's important to have a good diet. So just my final slide really, which is that I believe passionately that this information, this extraordinary science that we're now beginning to understand about extra virgin olive oil is a story that's waiting to be told, because people out there who are selecting their vegetable oil or their canola oil or their low quality extra virgin olive oil just don't really understand and appreciate the health-giving properties of a really high-quality extra virgin olive oil. So I think we need to be communicating the stories about the real Mediterranean diet, about extra virgin olive oil. We also need to talk about heritage. We also need to talk about the taste, the importance of those bitterness, that pepperiness, and of quality, and about how what you pay for actually matters, because if you pay that little bit more for a good quality extra virgin olive oil, you are getting something which is doing something extraordinary for your health. That's also about traceability, stories of polyphenols, stories about how we educate people to understand more about how they can benefit from this extraordinary product. Its health, and also about its value, because, as I say, the next time we go into a supermarket, we see people selecting extra virgin olive oil for €3, €4 for a bottle. You just can't produce really high quality extra virgin olive oil for that kind of money. So to some extent, you probably get what you pay for, but it's actually about identifying regions and areas that carry that heritage proudly and pronounce on their bottles, pronounce on their products that actually they are phenomenally proud because they know the secrets of extra virgin olive oil like this. And Antonio, you know, my friend and colleague here is an absolute ambassador for communicating those benefits so that people can make choices, so that they can buy high quality extra virgin olive oil. And you know, I think we often look at wine, for example, and we think about Bordeaux as a region that produces in general very, very good quality wines. And we don't have that yet in our head for extra virgin olive oil. And I think the possibilities for the Poniente de Granada is to say to the world, here we are in this most extraordinary, beautiful part of Spain, producing these extraordinarily high quality extra virgin olive oils. When you go and select an extra virgin olive oil, you can absolutely guarantee that if it comes from the Poniente de Granada PDO, that actually you are going to get that level of quality that will give you that level of health. The traceability there, the authenticity is there. We know the farms, we know the cooperatives, we know the people who produce it, we know the care they go to, and we know that this is ultimately going to help your health. So I think there is huge promise, huge potential for marketing as a PDO to say, here we are, this is our history, this is our story, and this is what we can bring to you, and this is our gift to you, consumers, to benefit your health. So thank you.